The New King James Version is the best Bible translation, and so's the Modern English Version, for certain people in certain circumstances. Who are those people, and what are those circumstances? 1. The New King James Version is best for you if your church has already chosen it. I know I frustrate people when I get this apparently pragmatic. They expect me to say that a particular translation is the best, but I won't, and I'm not being merely pragmatic. I'm sticking to my principles. The differences among the major modern evangelical English Bible translations, at least the ones designed to be used in actual churches, are not significant enough to cause me to say to someone, you need to use a different translation than your pastor. The exception might be those whose pastors are King James only. I would shade the advice just a little bit. To you I say, by all means, bring the King James Version to church. Don't cause an unnecessary row. But don't use the King James exclusively at home. It's not translated into your English. You need to understand your Bible. But the New King James Version and the Modern English Version are fine contemporary translations done by serious people, and they are translated into fully intelligible contemporary English. If your pastor has chosen one of these and you're wondering, what translation should I buy? Just buy the one he chose. The New King James Version comes out in a goodly number of nice editions. The MEV maybe not so much. I lean toward the New King James if I have to choose, but I don't, and neither do you. Get both if you want. No one's going to stop you. 2. The New King James Version or Modern English Version is best for you if you're a pastor who's trying to lead your church out of King James onlyism and your people have reservations they can't resolve about the critical text of the New Testament. The New King James Version and Modern English Version are basically the only major contemporary evangelical English Bible translations that are based on the same Hebrew and Greek text as the King James. They use, in other words, the Textus Receptus as the base text of the New Testament translation for each one. This is the text, the TR, that mainstream King James onlyists say is the object of their defense. They say the text is the issue. So let's say that you, though you grew up in King James only circles, have come to realize that New Testament textual criticism as it's practiced by the great majority of evangelical Christians who engage in it, such as myself, is not wicked and evil, but necessary. You've come to see that the TR itself is the product of textual criticism, just at an earlier stage and with less evidence to go on, and started by a Catholic Erasmus. But you just know you're not going to get anywhere trying to teach all this complicated stuff to sheep who've been confused already by King James onlyism. They are wedded to the TR. Your doctrinal statement mentions the TR. What do you do? First, you need to ask yourself whether integrity might demand that you just leave whatever ministry position you're in. If you're a missionary for a mission board with a King James only doctrinal statement, or if you teach at a college that is King James only, maybe this isn't your battle to fight and you should just bless the brothers and sisters around you and leave with no fuss. Spend your departure wisely, of course. Be very clear with the leadership, but not with others, aside perhaps from very close friends who come and ask you. Tell the leaders you can't subscribe to King James onlyism any longer, that the dead words and false friends created by language change are a serious problem in tension with 1 Corinthians 14. But if you're the pastor of a church that has a King James only doctrinal statement, I think you've got to use prudence. Perhaps you, too, ought to leave if you have come to form doctrinal convictions different from those of the leadership and of the church body. If, in other words, you're likelier to destroy the church than anything else. King James only churches are full of Christ's sheep, and God's Spirit has given them gifts. Sometimes I do think it's better to leave a church than split it, especially when the sheep are mainly confused and not so much recalcitrant, disobedient. But there are mitigating factors. What if, for example, you happen to know that the founding pastor of your church was decidedly not King James only, but his successor came and took it in a King James only direction? Or what if you've come to see that King James onlyism is divisive and erroneous, a threat to the unity of Christ's body, and it's worth the risk of a split in your judgment? This is your judgment to make. You are the shepherd. Or what if you think that the people in your church really do understand, minus a few outliers, let's say, that the text is the issue, and they're actually sympathetic with your desire to move to a contemporary translation just one that uses the TR, then consider the New King James and Modern English Version. Again, they use the same texts, Hebrew and Greek, as the King James. King James onlyists will say they don't. They'll say that the King James is the only Bible based on the pure Hebrew and Greek texts. I've seen this claim countless times. I just saw it yet again the other day in the work of someone who absolutely has been given the chance to know better. He is bearing false witness. But friend, the New King James and Modern English Version are based on the same text as the King James Version. Their prefaces say so. Repeated examination that I've done myself says so. And if you don't have the necessary Hebrew and Greek knowledge to verify this one way or the other, then that's all the more reason to avoid dragging your people through issues like textual criticism that your people won't understand, not if you don't. It's really okay, I think, to acknowledge your areas of weakness, to give liberty to other Christians, and just decide you're going to stick with the Textus Receptus. To any King James onlyists who made it this far in the video and are incensed right now that I advised some pastors of King James only churches to consider leading these churches to the New King James Version, I beg you to put yourself in my shoes. I believe King James onlyism is doctrinally wrong. And though I've said that sometimes integrity will demand that pastors who disagree quietly bow out, I think that sometimes integrity will demand that other pastors lead their people out of that false doctrine. You would say the same thing to a man who develops King James only or Textus Receptus convictions while pastoring a church that uses the ESV or NASB, right? Wouldn't you? 3. The New King James or Modern English Version is best for you if you're a pastor who's trying to lead your church out of King James onlyism and you have reservations you can't resolve about the critical text. Or what if you just really are on the other side of this textual critical debate from me? What if you feel like the TR really probably is the better text? I mean, it's the one God has used, as they say. The critical text was found in a trash can, they say. The critical text takes verses out of the Bible, they say. Don't the most ungodliest liberals use the critical text? Ideally, given the sheer number of good, faithful, doctrinally careful brothers who use critical text Bibles, such as myself, I think you should listen to the best proponents of my position. Take the free Credo House course by Dan Wallace on textual criticism. That's my top recommendation. Or my second is read the little intro to the Tyndale House Greek New Testament by Dirk Jonkind, Crossway title. But at the very least, acknowledge your areas of ignorance in Christian humility, like I said a moment ago, and if the arguments were as simple as the trash can story, why would the vast majority of evangelical Christians who can read Greek at a high level and are inerrantists be fine with the critical text? Yes, the majority isn't right because we're the majority, but the minority isn't right just because it thinks of itself as the faithful remnant. I'm something of a Rechabite. Remember the Rechabites? They held on to their forefathers' refusal to drink alcohol, and in Jeremiah, the Lord honored them for it. In general, I tend conservative. I myself don't drink alcohol, in large part because the people who shaped me don't. I want to honor them as much as I can. Also, I figure that if God put me in premillennialist circles, for example, and I just can't see my way to a different position from Scripture alone because I'm just kind of lost in the details, it's probably best for me to remain pre-mill. Perhaps you feel similarly about the Textus Receptus. You were told by teachers and pastors that you love and trust and respect for good reason, that the text is the issue, out of honor to them. And because you find the arguments back and forth bewildering, you just don't feel comfortable leaving the TR behind. Fine, brother, it's totally fine. Use the New King James or Modern English Version. It's my TR-only brothers who insist that the differences between the TR editions and the critical text editions are massive and significant. I don't think they are. So why should I fight you or even object to your use of your God-given liberty to use the TR? Go ahead. The New King James and Modern English Version are worthy translations done by responsible people, and they're TR-based. 4. The New King James or MEV is best for you only if you can't find your way in your conscience to a critical text Bible. There's a flip side to my argument in this video. The New King James and MEV are good translations, but the only reasons I can think of for using them are their base texts. Either you are unpersuaded or confused by arguments for the critical text of the New Testament, or your sheep are. In my experience, however, very, very few lay Christians in King James only circles know that they're supposed to be Textus Receptus only, not King James only. Very, very, very few of them know that the text is supposed to be the issue. And almost none of them can distinguish text from translation reliably when discussions about the topic arise. How could they? They can't look at an NIV and know whether a given difference between the King James and the NIV is due to textual critical differences or to translation philosophy. So moving to the New King James Version isn't going to help you with lay King James only Christians, not many of them. Move to the NKJV and you will lose some people from your church. If you're no longer convinced by arguments in favor of the Textus Receptus, then don't move to the New King James or Modern English Version. I personally doubt that there are more than a tiny few people in your church who would accept the New King James Version but not the ESV. Some of those who say the text is the issue, who even insist that they're not King James only, will leave your church if you use anything other than the King James Version, even another TR-based Bible. They might not even realize that they truly are just King James only. But maybe you have one exceptional deacon in your church, a godly engineer who really does his homework, who clearly understands the difference between King James onlyism and TR onlyism. And out of honor to him, you want to go with the New King James Version. More power to you. If given the chance, I would move to a critical text Bible if I could. I do believe that the critical text is closer to what the New Testament authors wrote than is the Textus Receptus. But I don't think the textual differences between the Textus Receptus and the critical text, between, that is, the New King James Version and the ESV, are significant enough to justify alienating that godly engineer who's a church leader. Our King James only brothers often call the NKJV a bridge to the modern versions. This is a version of the slippery slope argument. If you start using the New King James Version instead of the King James Version, they say, you'll soon be conducting same-sex weddings or baptizing babies in alcohol or voting Democrat. And people like me who promote the use of the New King James Version, they say, are actually secretly hoping that you'll move further away from the New King James Version and into critical text Bibles. But there's no secret here. Yes, I would love for you to have freedom in your conscience to use critical text Bibles as I do and profit from them greatly. I do definitely ask that you give me that freedom, that you trust that I have God-honoring reasons for my choice, even if I prove to be wrong. But I'm not secretly hoping that the New King James Version will be a bridge for you. I'm truly happy if you land there and if you stay there. The New King James Version is best for you, fifth, if you want easy text-critical notes in your English Bible. I almost forgot to say this. I did forget to say this, and that's why I'm recording this on a different day in the greenhouse. The New King James Version is good for those who want text-critical notes in English in the margins of the New Testament. I forgot to say this because it's really hard for me to think of who really needs this and who would want it, even though, in theory, it's right up my alley. Let me explain a bit. Until the New King James came out in the early 1980s, it was essentially impossible for the average Christian to see where the Textus Receptus and Nestle Aland critical texts of the New Testament differed. These are Greek New Testaments. Until the Net Bible came out in 2001 with all its text critical notes, the New King James was basically the only tool that I'm aware of that could help you if all you knew was English. Nowadays, we have the Lexham textual notes on the Bible, which actually covers both Testaments. And we have my own KJVParallelBible.org, which I really need to do a video on, and which covers the New Testament in what I hope is a particularly clear and helpful way. I tend to use these tools, or honestly, to just check the Greek myself, often enough in the SBL GNT, which has an apparatus that tells me when the majority text, and therefore usually the TR, differs from the critical text. And I think there is a wasp, no, thankfully a fly. But it's indeed handy to be told about many minor and the few major variations between the two major families of printed editions of the Greek New Testament. This is how the New King James preface describes what those text-critical notes in the New King James margin are doing. because the New King James Version is the fifth revision of a historic document translated from specific Greek texts. They're talking about the King James. The editors decided to retain the traditional text, they're talking about the TR, in the body of the New Testament, and to indicate major critical and majority text variant readings in the pop-up notes. So that's what you'll see. At John 8:2, part of the woman caught in adultery story, there's a footnote on the New King James phrase, now early in the morning. It says, very early. In other words, the Textus Receptus differs from the majority text. That's the M at this point. At Matthew 5:27, part of the Sermon on the Mount, the New King James reads, you have heard that it was said to those of old. A note reads that NU and M omit to those of old. The Nestle UBS, that's the NU, the critical text, in other words, along with the majority of manuscripts we have, do not include those words. I have more than a quibble with that word omit in the New King James margin. To say omit makes it sound like the words were taken out. That stacks the deck. What if, as I would allege, and most evangelical biblical scholars would, those words were added in, almost certainly done innocently in order to make this verse fit with other paragraphs in the sermon? I'd rather the footnote said the neutral does not include rather than omit. I think this is a significant difference, but that in a nutshell is what you'll see in the New King James textual notes. But who needs this? Who benefits from this? King James onlyists view the mere presence of critical text readings in the margin of the New King James as a moral taint upon the whole version. They won't touch it. The existence, a lot of them won't touch it. The existence of those readings actually became a rural legend, this is my theory, which has led King James onlyists to proclaim that the New King James actually is not based on the TR like it says it is. The legend started with, the New King James has critical text readings in the margins, which is true. It soon enough became, though, the New King James has critical text readings, full stop, which is not true. And now, most King James onlyists, in my experience, don't know that the New King James New Testament is based on the TR. They insist to me over and over in my YouTube comments that I'm wrong when I say that it is. An effort to be open and honest and clear and maybe even helpful on the part of the New King James translators has been rewarded, as so many good deeds are, by cavil, which, if it do not find a hole, will make one. Never mind that the King James itself had textual notes in the margin in both Testaments. This should not have been a problem. TR proponents ideally should have seen the New King James as a friend, and its textual notes as a perfect opportunity to demonstrate to the world the superiority of the readings in the TR. But instead, they've ended up repeating an untruth about the New King James as a result. This neat little tool, added so hopefully 40 years ago, has not helped the New King James be adopted by any users of the King James that I know of. But maybe you're different. Maybe you would see the value in these notes, a value that really is there. 2 times recently in church, one of our elders used or mentioned the Lexham Press book, Piercing Heaven, Prayers of the Puritans. I turned to my wife and I said, I edited that book. Editing books doesn't impress my wife as much as building greenhouses and walk-in coolers, which you can't see. It's in the back of my garage. But I try anyway. I wasn't the only editor for the book, but I was basically in charge of it at Lexham Press. It's a really great title. The Puritans were a special breed of people who put head and heart together in the service of God. I recommend this book as a devotional aid, and I even helped a little to make it look especially nice typographically. But the first edition contained a pretty significant editorial oversight that was 100% my fault. I forgot to check which Bible translation the compiler of the book used. I forgot to aim at consistency in Bible quotations. Turns out the ESV got quoted without the appropriate citation, and that's just kind of rude and unprofessional. We didn't get sued, and we wouldn't. We're all Christians. We just got the problem fixed for the second printing. By the way, actual readers will not notice any difference, and I definitely highly recommend this book to you. I later asked myself, why did I, of all people, forget to think about what Bible translation this book used? One might assume that that would be the very first thing on my mind. Here's where I'm going with this. What I came to was a realization. I don't mainly think of translations as wholes anymore, W-H-O-L-E-S. I think of them as collections of countless individual decisions. At literally any given place in the Bible, there are mildly different options for how you translate stuff. Occasionally, there are majorly different options. I don't spend my life looking at the forests that are the NIV, ESV, King James, and New King James. I spend my life looking at the trees, actually the twigs. The translations overlap so much. They really are all just saying the same things over and over. Again, I don't spend a lot of time thinking of them as wholes. So, when I come to these videos about different Bible translations as wholes, the best Bible translation series, I don't tend to get into the twigs because really at that level, all the major modern evangelical English Bible translations are basically good. I talk instead about the big ideas, the translation philosophy that undergirds different translations, the gender language, the way they approach it, the quality and number of printed editions, which is actually really significant. And for the New King James, the textual basis. The New King James is a fine translation on the English level. I have very few complaints. Plenty of individual things to praise, a few to question, but no more in either category than any other major English Bible. I think it really is in the big ideas, the philosophy and method, that Bible translations differ. So I can't get away from textual criticism as the main reason to use or not use the New King James. If you prefer the TR, you should seriously consider the New King James or Modern English Version. As I've said to countless YouTube commenters who want to argue textual criticism with me so many times that I just saved this paragraph of text with a keyboard shortcut. My friend, the New King James Version and the Modern English Version both use the same underlying Hebrew and Greek text as the King James. And they translate those texts into fully intelligible, contemporary English, which means they meet the principle of 1 Corinthians 14. Edification requires intelligibility. I commend the New King James and MEV to you. Next time, the New Living Translation is the best Bible translation.